Thank you for joining us and welcome to today's research webinar, How You Can Address Mileage Fee Concerns, Evidence from 3 Studies. I'm Sarah Schramer. I'm the Policy Director for the National Center for Sustainable Transportation. Housed at the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis, the National Center for Sustainable Transportation, or NCST, is part of the University Transportation Centers program administered by the U.S. Department of Transportation. The NCST provides national leadership in advancing environmentally sustainable transportation through cutting-edge research, direct policy engagement, and education of our future leaders. UC Davis leads the NCST consortium with partner centers at CSU Long Beach, Georgia Tech, Texas Southern University, UC Riverside, University of Southern California, and the University of Vermont. We will be recording this webinar, and the recording will be available on our website along with the presentation slides in the coming days. If you have any technical issues, please let us know in the chat, and we will do our best to assist you. During the presentation, please use the Q&A feature that's available via a button at the bottom of the Zoom window to type in your questions. We'll reserve time after the presentation to get through as many questions as possible. And lastly, you're going to see a quick survey at the end of the webinar for you to share your thoughts with us on today's presentations and also ideas for future presentations as well. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. We have with us Dr. Greg Rowangould. He is an associate professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Vermont and director of the UVM Transportation Research Center. His expertise is in modeling transportation systems and travel behavior, transportation policy evaluation, and mobile source emission and air quality analysis. His research focuses on understanding how the design and operation of transportation systems and transportation policy affect the sustainability of communities, of public health, and of equity. And we're also joined by Claire Nelson, a civil and environmental engineering MS student from the shoreline of Connecticut. She was awarded the WTS Vermont 2023 Graduate Scholarship. She'll be presenting along with Dr. Rowangould today. And with that, I think I will pass it over to Dr. Rowangould to get us started. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, so we're going to talk about some research we started about 2 years ago. So here at UVM, and Claire's really the one that has done most of the work and will present this. And I just wanted to give a little bit of a background on where this started. Is we have some really unique data that we're going to share from Vermont on how people drive and what they drive. And the state of Vermont was considering, like many states right now, how to deal with more electric vehicles and declining transportation funding. And so we thought about ways to use this data to start looking at the equity impacts of that. And that then led into a series of other studies looking at support for mileage fees and different ways that could be structured. And the effects of sharing different types of information about these policies and how that affects what people think about them and their level of support. And so that's kind of a broad overview of the research that we'll talk about today and sort of where it came from. And so I'll turn it over to Claire, who will walk you through the studies.
Great, thanks, Greg. Just want to share my screen really quick. Okay, great. So thank you everybody for joining us today. I'm going to presenting most of this, and then Greg will jump back in at the end for questions. So I wanted to start by talking about the transportation funding problem, which most people are probably aware of, and Greg gave a nice overview to it too. But generally, most states and the federal government are dealing with the repercussions of declining gasoline consumption. As gasoline consumption has declined, our revenue generating ability from things like a per gallon tax, like the gas tax, has also declined. So there's a funding shortfall, and this declining gasoline consumption is, as most people are aware, due to electric vehicles generally increasing fuel economies. So even vehicles that are still consuming gasoline or consuming less per mile than they have historically. And there's some evidence too that VMT is also, or vehicle miles traveled are also declining. And then this is coupled with the effects of the declining purchasing power of US dollars due to inflation. So overall, that has left a gap in funding for a lot of states and the federal government. And there's been a lot of solutions that people have talked about. Some people have talked about raising the gas tax, so increasing the per gallon rate that a lot of states and the federal government charge. You could also index the gas tax to inflation. People have talked about raising vehicle registration and inspection fees in states, or shifting funding from other revenue streams like income taxes or local options taxes. And then what I'll primarily be focusing on today is these distance-based charges, which have many different names: mileage fees, road user charges, vehicle miles travel taxes, but these have become increasingly popular. There's also states have considered using tolling, congestion charging, or just generally cutting down on inefficiencies to try and close this funding gap. Uh, but what it comes down to really is how do we choose an option to help gain revenue for our transportation systems? And so we have been using this comparison criteria. The first of which is just whether or not the funding source can gain the adequate amount of revenue for states or the federal government, and whether or not it can do that sustainably. There's also the political feasibility, which is, how does the public feel about this? How visible would this be? The technical feasibility, like, is the technology ready and able to be implemented as soon as we need it to be? Social equity is a big concern too. Are people paying for the benefits they receive, and how are people paying across different income groups and community types? And economic efficiency too. Are people responsive to this? Are they changing their behavior because of this type of fee? And finally, the administrative costs. So what we've done in our work is evaluate these first four things. The last two are definitely in need of more evaluation, and we're going to talk a little bit less about them, but still happy to chat about them at the end of the webinar. So like I said, today we're going to be focusing on mileage fees. And as Greg said, this kind of came about because our state, Vermont, was interested in mileage fees to supplement lost revenue from electric vehicles. Mileage fees are being explored by a lot of states across the nation right now. They have this nice user fee design, which makes them intuitively powerful. There's also the chance for long-term financial sustainability, because as long as people are traveling miles on the road, you'd be getting money from them. And they're recently more feasible too. Odometer readings are now in every vehicle. A lot of states already collect them. And also vehicles now have in-vehicle navigation units, which is a powerful way to collect mileage information as well. But there's some very notable cons, and that's what we focus on today. For one, mileage fees have pretty low public support. There's also a lot of concerns about the privacy of mileage fees. People tend to feel that they're going to be tracked with a mileage fee. The fairness of them, how they'd impact specifically rural and low-income communities, and also how much they would cost. So we're going to dig into that in a bit. There's also this uncertain administrative costs when you're to charging every user of the roadway instead of charging gas stations for like a gas tax. So we talk about that less, but that's definitely a concern with mileage fees. So the first study I'll be talking about today is currently published. The link is down at the bottom, and I think somebody will share in the chat too. But it uses this cool data that we have access to in Vermont. We have the vehicle registration and inspection records from our Department of Motor Vehicles. And so with this study, what we primarily wanted to do was look at what would an appropriate mileage fee rate be to replace the current revenue stream from the Vermont state gas tax? So, what would be the right pricing? And then how would this revenue neutral mileage fee, if we applied it to all holds in Vermont, so every vehicle that's registered in Vermont, they're now paying a hypothetical mileage fee. What would that impact be on Vermont households financially? And then how do these financial impacts differ by the household's income and the community type that they live in? And for this study, we simplified community type to just the rural, suburban, urban trio. So I'm going to share a bit more about what this data actually looks like, because it is pretty unique to our state, and we had put in a lot of work to get it ready. So for every vehicle in Vermont, Vermont requires an annual vehicle safety inspection. And at these safety inspections, your odometer reading is written down. So what you can do is look at subsequent years of inspections. So the inspection from the current year with the inspection from the previous year, look at those odometer readings and calculate the difference to get how far that vehicle traveled in any given year that we have inspection data for them. So for every vehicle registered in Vermont, because they're required to have these annual vehicle inspections, we can figure out how far that vehicle traveled in any given year. The other data set that we used was the vehicle registration records. So these registration records have vehicles' mailing addresses with them. And they also have the vehicle's unique identification number. So by running that vehicle identification number, or VIN, through this decoder that was developed by our Transportation Research Center, we were able to get a lot of information about the vehicles that wasn't already in the records. So that would be the gross vehicle weight, the make and model of the vehicle, number of axles, all of these different things, which we can then feed into the EPA fuel economy database and get the fuel economy of the car. So we can combine all of this information together. We have how far the vehicle traveled from the inspection records, where the vehicle is located from the registration records, and its fuel economy from the VIN. And what we get when we put all of that together is, for every vehicle registered in Vermont, a pretty robust understanding of how that vehicle is traveling. We can then look at all of the vehicles registered at the same address and assume that they're a household. So for every unique address that we have in Vermont, we know all the vehicles that are registered there in any given year, and each of those vehicles' mileages for any given year. So as you can imagine, this is a pretty cool data set that we could do a lot of different things with. For the purposes of this study, we excluded commercial and heavy-duty vehicles, just allowing us to focus on personal household vehicles. So the final data set is about 310,000 vehicles across about 190,000 households in Vermont. For each of these, to preserve people's privacy, we aggregated things to this 2-kilometer square grid cell, as you're seeing it in this map. But within each of these grid cells is a lot of households. And this is a map of Vermont for people who have never seen a map of Vermont before. So for each of the households in our data set, we then calculated their annual gas tax and mileage fee costs. So for the gas tax, because we have the actual gas tax, the price per gallon of fuel charged in the state of Vermont, the vehicle's fuel economy and their mileage, we could calculate the annual gas tax. Then for the mileage fee, we had calculated a revenue neutral mileage fee based on the total amount of revenue that we're currently bringing in through the state gas tax. So if we were now charging people per mile and wanted to bring in the same amount of money, we calculated a revenue neutral mileage fee of 1.5 cents per mile. And that's comparable to what other states have calculated as their revenue neutral fee. We then applied the odometer reading data from each of the vehicles so we could calculate how much each vehicle will be spending under this hypothetical revenue neutral mileage fee. And then we calculated household costs by just summing all of the individual vehicle costs for the unique households. So we then looked at this data spatially. We have how much each household is spending in gas taxes and how much they would be spending under this revenue neutral mileage fee. And those are the two maps shown side by side here. What I want to point out is that for people who aren't very familiar with Vermont, we've highlighted some of the 3 main urban centers, Burlington, Montpelier, and Rutland. And you can see that generally in these more urban areas, people are spending slightly less money in gas taxes. Outside of them, you see darker colors, higher costs. People in more rural areas are spending more in transportation taxes. And this is under a gas tax or under a mileage fee. So with this mileage fee, rural households would still be generally paying more in transportation taxes than their urban counterparts. But you can also see that even within these urban areas and even within rural areas, there's still a lot of heterogeneity or just variation in what people are paying. So the costs are really pretty widespread regardless of the community that you're residing in. What we then did is looked at the difference for each of the households. So what you're looking at here is the average difference in costs if we were to switch from a gas tax to a revenue neutral mileage fee. And you can see that most households are going to see a cost increase. They'd be paying up to between $5 less and $50 more. And on average, they'd be paying $23 more under this revenue neutral mileage fee. Um, the reason why households are paying more on average is because under the gas tax, larger commercial vehicles are contributing a large proportion of that cost in gallons of gasoline consumed. They tend to have lower fuel economies and very high mileage, so the number of gallons of gasoline that they consume is relatively large. So when you shift to a revenue neutral mileage fee and every vehicle in the state is paying the same fee, then households are going to be paying disproportionately more. And I'm happy to clarify that point a bit more if anyone's confused on that. But generally, households would be paying more if mileage fees are just one flat rate for all vehicles. A way to get around this could be charging separate mileage fees for personal and commercial vehicles. So on average, households would see a $0 change in costs with a mileage fee. But because it's just 1.5 cents per mile, regardless of whether you're driving a heavy duty truck or a light duty sedan, those light duty household vehicles are going to be facing higher costs. We then looked at what this change in household tax burden from switching from the gas tax to a mileage fee would look like across the different income brackets in Vermont. And we find that across these income brackets, there's a lot of variation in what people would be charged. But you can kind of simplify this a little bit and look at just the average household change and costs. So we did this for looking at 3 different income categories and 3 different community types. And generally what we find is that low income and rural households on average, as you can see on the graph here with the blue and yellow bars, are paying slightly less than urban households, which are in the pink. There is one exception here in that low income households in suburban communities are a potential community of concern. They on average see higher changes in costs than people in urban households or people in higher income households. So this is potentially something for states to consider. But for the most part, when looking at low income and rural households, their average cost change would be less than that of rural or of urban and higher income households. So ultimately, looking at all of this, we took this really unique data that we have in Vermont, these vehicle inspection and registration records. We were able to calculate gas tax and mileage fee costs for over 360,000 vehicles in our state, which is 190,000 households. So a lot of data. And what we found is that, if we were to do a revenue neutral mileage fee in Vermont, it would be 1.5 cents per mile. Everybody is generally paying more because heavy duty trucks would be paying less when switching away from the gas tax. So one way to get around that could be charging separate mileage fees for personal vehicles and commercial vehicles. We also found that mileage fees would have pretty minimal financial impacts on Vermont households. It would be on average a difference of $23 a year, ranging from saving $5 to paying $50 more. Which is typically a pretty small proportion of somebody's overall annual income. Also, we found that mileage fees are somewhat less regressive than the gas tax when looking at how the gas tax distributes across income brackets versus how it distributes across the mileage fee costs. And then we also found that mileage fees, again, on average, will result in lower cost increases for rural and low income households relative to urban and higher income households. But it's also important to keep in mind that there's a wide variation in what all low income households pay, what all urban households pay across income and across community type. There would be a wide range of costs. But if you're interested in just talking on the average, it seems like mileage fees would be generally more equitable than the gas tax. So that was our first study looking at mileage fee equity. We then moved on to say, okay, well, we found that generally mileage fees would be more equitable than the gas tax, but that's not the common narrative that's out there in the world. A lot of people still have concerns about rural and low-income households and how they would be financially impacted by a mileage fee. So we were interested in looking at public opinion of mileage fees and the extent to which that was related to how much people know about mileage fees. In addition to, an education potentially shift support for mileage fees. If people know more about what they're voting on. So we first did this using a survey that we fielded to Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. And then based on the information that we gained from that survey, where we got about 623 responses. Based on the information we gained from that, we then implemented this national survey where we got 2,114 responses. So in this study, we're really focusing on public and political support for mileage fees. Specifically, and like I briefly mentioned before, we wanted to know, what is the current level of support for a mileage fee to replace the gas tax? And we're talking about state gas taxes here, not the federal gas tax. How does support vary with demographics, where people are located, their geography, and as well as their personal attitudes, how they feel about government, community, the environment, technology, things like that. We also wanted to know, as I'd said before, to what extent is policy support guided by information or potentially misinformation or, a lack of information? And then to what extent can support be shifted by providing education to the respondents in our survey? So what I'm going to do is walk through how the survey functioned and then share what we found from the results. So we implemented 3 identical surveys at a national scale. Each of the surveys was completely identical, except for the way that respondents were told their mileage information would be collected. So at the beginning of the survey, a respondent was allowed to vote. Do you support a mileage fee? Yes or no? And they were told that either this mileage fee would be collected using annual odometer readings, it would be collected using a plug-in device that plugs into their vehicle without a GPS, or a plug-in device with a GPS. Excuse me. Losing my voice. And I've put the number of responses per each of these surveys here. So 3 completely identical surveys, except that respondents were randomly assigned a mileage collection option. And we did that because we hypothesized that people likely have an idea in their head of how their mileage would be collected when you ask them about a mileage fee. So we just wanted to control for that. You know exactly how your mileage is going to be collected within this survey. What we then did was educate them. So we have their, initial vote based on their prior knowledge. And then we wanted to see if we give them some education about the gas tax, which is the policy they're considering replacing, and the mileage fee, which would be the replacement policy. Does that actually shift their opinion? So we designed these 2 videos, which the QR codes are linked here on the slide if you're interested. They're also linked in our NCST report in the appendices, I believe, if you don't have time to scan these now. And the gas tax video talked about, motivations for replacing the gas tax, kind of the history of the gas tax in the US. And the mileage fee video talked about what a mileage fee would look like, different options for collecting mileage, and what's currently known about the fairness of a mileage fee based on prior studies. So how would a mileage fee impact low-income households, rural households, EV drivers, things like that? After this round of education, they were then allowed to vote a second time. So they had their initial vote, they were educated about the policy, and then they're allowed to reflect and change their vote if they would like to. And this was just identical to the first voting opportunity. After the second vote, we collected some vehicle information from the respondents. We asked them, to the best of your knowledge, what's the fuel economy of your vehicle? To the best of your knowledge, how far did you travel in the last year? And then we calculated a gas tax and a mileage fee cost for them and showed it to them on the survey. So these costs were calculated using flat numbers, not the actual gas tax rates from states. What we really wanted to do is see, if people are educated about costs, how does that change their opinion? We less wanted to calculate a perfectly accurate cost for them, because a lot of states are still figuring out what a mileage fee would look like for them if they were to implement it at all. So they were shown something like this, where, based on what we estimated, this was what you would pay this is what you're currently paying with the fuel tax, and this is what you would pay under a mileage fee. And then they were allowed to vote one last time. So by the end of the survey, they had this policy education through videos and quiz style questions that reinforced what the videos taught people. And then this cost education where we presented them with personalized cost estimates based on their vehicle information. And finally, at the end, people were just allowed to reflect and share a bit more on how they voted. Because all we saw throughout the survey was what they said, yes or no to a mileage fee to replace the gas tax. We wanted to know, what was going on in their head. How were they thinking about the educational experiences? What were the most important educational experiences? Things like that. We also collected a series of attitudinal and like belief related preferences from the respondents so that we could try to measure the impact of people's, latent attitudes on their policy opinions. The list of questions is here. I'm not going to read through them, but generally they cover, people's feelings about government, people's feelings about the environment, feelings about, air quality, vehicles, and technology. And we also collected classic demographic variables so that we could control for differences between respondents. So the first thing that I want to share from what we learned from this survey is that public knowledge about the gas tax is generally pretty limited. At the beginning of the survey, we'd asked people some quiz style questions about their state gas tax. And we found that generally respondents lack information about the gas tax or are maybe slightly misinformed about it. Most people didn't know that the gas tax was a per gallon charge in their state. Some states have additions to it that are a sales tax, but the base gas tax and the federal gas tax is a per gallon charge. Most people didn't know that. Most people also didn't know when the gas tax was last increased in their state. And we didn't ask them like what day, what year. This was a general time range of like 5-year increments. Related to that, most people didn't thought that the gas tax was increased in the last year within their state, which is true for almost no states across the United States. So people have kind of these inflated perceptions that these taxes are increasing. And that might not be specific to gas taxes, but we asked it specifically related to gas taxes in this survey. And then also, most people didn't know what the gas tax even funds. Generally, people thought that revenue from the gas tax could be spent on just about anything, and didn't know that it's primarily used to fund transportation programs. So what all of this means is that people don't necessarily know a lot about the policy that they're being asked to vote on. And kind of on a broader, like stepping back from this survey in particular, we just wanted to highlight that it's difficult to gather accurate public opinion data from people who don't really know much about the questions that they're being asked. And that generally, misinformed respondents or respondents who just are generally uninformed, they're more likely to answer randomly. This is supported by the literature, rather than consistently. And so relying on public opinion data from respondents who are just lacking information may not be reflective of how people actually feel and may be potentially biasing these public opinion results. So I just wanted to state that really quickly. But so the context here is that we found people don't really know much about the gas tax. So I'm going to dig into now how people voted across the survey and how their voting changed as they became, as with the educational experiences that we provided them. So during the first vote, what we find is that public support for mileage fees is pretty low. The percent of people voting yes to a mileage fee is at about 32%. And remember, we'd asked people, we'd randomly assigned people a mileage collection option. So we also wanted to see, is there more support for, odometer readings, mileage fees collected using odometer readings? Is support higher for mileage fees collected using, plug-in devices with GPS? So on this chart here, we've split out how people voted by the type of mileage collection option that we told them they would receive. So in the first vote, generally pretty low support. After the first vote, if you remember, we then showed them those educational videos. So by the second vote, support increased pretty dramatically. And we see that, for odometer readings and plug-in devices without a GPS, support had jumped to over 50%. There was still an increase for plug-in devices with GPS, but it wasn't as substantial as the increase for these, you could call them like lower tech options, odometer readings or non-GPS enabled devices. Andrew Jones, if you have a quick question, go ahead. I'm not sure. That's okay. If you want to type your question in the Q&A, I'd be happy to answer it later. Or maybe Greg could respond.
I just made it possible for Andrew to talk. I had to change the settings real quick.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Andrew, feel free. I'll give you a second. Okay, we can get to your question later then. So after this second vote, respondents were then shown the cost education, so those personalized cost estimates based on their self-reported vehicle information. And support decreased slightly, but it still remained above these initial support levels. So, support remained almost relatively the same for the plug-in devices with GPS, decreased slightly for the odometer readings and plug-in devices, but again, still above those pre-levels. So ultimately, what this is showing us is that mileage fee support generally increases after the respondents were educated, and that we have larger increases in support for mileage fees that were collected using odometer readings or those non-GPS plug-in devices. The next thing that we wanted to do is understand how these voting changes were potentially a factor of individual respondents, attitudes, demographics, things like that. Because these are just, looking at everybody all at once. We wanted to break people up into groups a little bit more and understand how different people responded to the voting opportunities. And we also wanted to look at whether or not these changes in voting were statistically significant. So I'm gonna briefly just run through our methods for evaluating changes in support, and these are described in much more detail in our NCST report for people who are very into methodologies. So we used two different types of models to evaluate the extent to which education impacted support for mileage fees to replace the gas tax. The first model that we used was a fixed effects model. And what this does is it effectively controls for, the individual part of voting. So it's the vote, whether they voted yes or no, was a function of their education, not their educational achievement, like high school, but the educational treatment. So the policy education videos and the cost education within our survey. So how they voted was a function of, which vote they were at in the survey, and then the individual characteristics of that respondent. And we also wanted to use a binary logistic regression model, which would then tease apart a little bit more the individual factors and their effects on how people voted. So, for example, you could test hypotheses like, are people in rural areas less likely to support a mileage fee? More kind of specific questions like that. So this one is a function of how somebody voted. It's how somebody voted as a function of their attitudes, which I'd listed all the attitudes that we came up with before, their demographics, their location data, all of that kind of information. Using the fixed effects model, which again is controlling for like the individual differences between respondents, what we find is that all respondents were more likely and statistically significantly more likely based on the p-values shown in the table there, which are less than 0.05, statistically significantly more likely to support a mileage fee after education. So the way to interpret the values in this table is that for the people who took the odometer reading survey, they were 10 times more likely to support a mileage fee after the policy education, which were those educational videos that they were shown. For the people who took the odometer reading survey, they were 5 times as likely to support a mileage fee after all of the education, the policy and the cost education. For people who were given the survey where they were told their mileage would be collected using a plug-in device that was GPS enabled, the effect sizes were slightly smaller. They were only 6 times as likely to support a mileage fee after education, between 4 and 6 times. But generally, they were still more likely to support the policy after education. So big takeaways here is that education was statistically significantly effective in changing support, and that change in support was an increase, and the effects were stronger with the non-GPS options. So education was better received amongst people who were told that their mileage would be collecting using odometer reading or a plug-in device without GPS. We then used binary logistic regression models to look at the people who increased their support for a mileage fee across the survey. So we just looked at the people who voted no at the beginning and then voted yes at the end. And we found that the people who were more likely to increase their support generally had a greater trust in government. They had a greater trust in science and technology. They generally perceived fairness of a mileage fee. They felt that a mileage fee would be more fair to them overall. And they also were typically the people who would be seeing cost savings. So the people who are more likely to increase support had all of these, all or some of these attributes about them relative to the rest of the survey sample. And so a takeaway here is that privacy concerns, specifically related to the higher tech mileage collection options, like the GPS-enabled devices, are influencing people's support for a mileage fee and willingness to increase support even after education. We also want to say that, these kind of simple educational experiences that we gave people in this survey may not necessarily be sufficient at changing people's attitudes. They're capable of addressing like lack of information, but not as capable of changing things like somebody's trust in the government, which we wouldn't expect because, again, these are pretty simple educational experiences. We then used binary logistic regression models to look at the people who decreased their support across the survey. So the people who originally voted yes, and then after the education said, no, I don't support a mileage fee to replace the state gas tax. Generally, the people who decreased their support after education had more of a distrust in government, a distrust in science and technology. They felt a mileage fee would be unfair to them personally. We also found that generally these people lived in suburban areas, and also that they tended to have households with more children in them. So yeah, again, kind of similar takeaways. These attitudinal factors are just, not really capable of being changed through these simple educational experiences. So I wanted to share now just as kind of some more general summary statistics. If anyone has questions about the modeling that we used, I'd be happy to come back to this. Or I'd refer you to the report for a more robust discussion. So at the very end of the survey in the reflection section, after education, how we asked them, sorry, I'm gonna take a step back. We asked people before the education how fair they felt mileage fee. So we asked them how fair they would feel a mileage fee would be for these different types of communities and how fair it was after education, in their opinion. We found that generally people did not change their perception of fairness, but the people who did generally tended to feel that rural communities, a mileage fee would be more fair for rural communities and more fair for lower income communities after they were educated. We also found that people have a preference for how their mileage is collected, and the rate structure that is being used. So generally people like this idea of a block rate, which is that you're charged for the first, lump of miles, you're charged one rate, and then once you go above that mileage, you're charged another rate. You can think of it like a tiered rate structure. So within a mileage range, you're being charged one rate. Within the next mileage range, you're being charged another. People also tended to like an income-based rate structure, and a pollution-based one. But notably, there was more opposition for lower rates for EVs than there was support. We also asked people, since they were told specifically how their mileage would be collected in their survey, we asked them at the end how they would feel if their mileage was collected using one of the other options. So the way to interpret these things on the left here is like odometer reading was the survey that they were given. We asked people who got the odometer reading survey, would you would you be more likely to support a mileage fee if it was collected using a plug-in device? Similarly, we asked you about odometer readings, but would you be more likely to support a mileage fee if it was collected using a plug-in device with a GPS? What we find is that people generally are more likely to support mileage fees that are collected using odometer readings. So for the people who were given the plug-in device surveys, they were more likely to support a mileage fee if they were allowed to choose an odometer reading as their mileage collection option. But about 40% of the respondents didn't mind how their mileage was collected, and it didn't change their opinion about a mileage fee. So that was the survey findings, and I'm going to try and kind of speed through this so we have time for questions. Ultimate takeaways here are that current support for the gas tax is pretty low, and attitudes are strongly associated with how people feel about mileage fees, and that these attitudes are less likely to change with these simple educational experiences that we used here. But the simple educational experiences do increase support, and we believe this is because they address a general lack of information about the gas tax and mileage fees amongst respondents. So filling information gaps is easier with the survey. So I want to just kind of highlight some key takeaways, and then dig into any questions that you all have. One of the biggest takeaways is that mileage fees we find would be more equitable than the gas tax. This was evidenced by our first study where we found that rural and low income households would generally see smaller cost increases than urban and higher income households. And what this means is that, misinformation or lack of information about mileage fees is pretty common, despite the number of studies out there, including ours, that note that inequity is really not much of a concern. So there's this kind of educational barrier. Also, we want to highlight that separate mileage fee rates are probably needed for personal and commercial vehicles. This is evidenced by our first study where all of the households saw a cost increase. So if you're a state looking to implement just a flat mileage fee rate, so like 1.5 cents per mile for all vehicles, including commercial vehicles, be wary that you might be disproportionately placing the tax burden onto households and away from commercial vehicles. And there's definitely more research that's needed to understand how commercial vehicles fit into mileage fee programs in the future. Also, for states who are currently looking to implement mileage fees, addressing public concerns is really important. We find that current mileage fee support is very low, and that after education, support increases. So there's misinformation out there, or potentially just people being uninformed about this, that can be addressed through pretty simple education. And we also want to say that, based on the number of respondents who changed their support for a mileage fee, this misinformation is widespread, and it's affecting public support. So it's an important thing for states looking to implement mileage fees to address. Also, if you're trying to, prioritize education, costs seem to be the most important to the respondents in our survey. So when we asked people what was the most, important factor in your voting, most respondents said it was the cost to education. And also based on our fixed effects models, we find that respondents were nearly 10 times as likely to support a mileage fee. And this was regardless of whether or not they learned they would save or lose money. So just, sharing cost information can be really valuable. We think this is likely because people tend to have inflated perceptions of how much they're spending in transportation taxes annually. And so by sharing that cost, you're helping them understand what that current cost is. And also because these cost differences are pretty small typically, we find on average it would be about $20 a year. We think that because people are more likely to support it kind of regardless of whether or not their costs are going up and down. Also, for states looking to implement mileage fees, it's important to keep in mind that there are genuine preferences for mileage fee collection and how you're charging the mileage fee. So half of the respondents in our survey preferred certain mileage fee rate structures and collection options. Those specifically were odometer readings were the preferred mileage collection option, and rate structures, people liked the idea of a block rate as well as an income-based rate. And notably, lower rates for EVs were less popular. What this means is that people likely are assuming something about a mileage fee when they're asked about it. They might be assuming that their information is going to be collected or their mileage information is going to be tracked. And so by being, really transparent with what a mileage fee means within your state, or allowing users a choice in how their mileage would be collected so that they can then decide what they're comfortable with, support might be changed. And also, like I'd said before, it's really important to inform survey respondents to gain reliable public opinion data. So just finally, we want to say that, people generally lack information about gas taxes and mileage fees. This knowledge gap is affecting support. Preferences are not fixed. By engaging people with policy education, you can these public opinions can be shifted. And that simple educational experiences can increase support, but they may not be able to affect people's attitudes, which we know impact their public opinion. And in the future, it's important for us to understand, how these educational experiences are shaping long-term values, because this was only within one survey. So yeah, I know I kind of rushed through the end there, but I would love to answer any questions that anyone has.
Okay, thank you so much, Claire. That was really interesting, and a lot of information to go through. We do have quite a few questions in here in the Q&A. It looks like Greg has answered a few of them live, or I'm sorry, typed his answers, which is really helpful. So maybe we'll get through a few of these in the next 10 minutes or so until the webinar ends. And I just wanted to make a note for folks that I will take the questions that have been asked and the answers that have been given and put them into a document just for easy access after the webinar, and we'll post that on the event website. So just a heads up about that. But yeah, maybe we can jump into a question. I don't know if Greg or Claire, if you've already identified one that you'd like to answer, or if I should just pick.
Yeah, I answered a few that are more like clarifying things and left a few of the other ones that I guess we could answer. So just looking back to these, and I think there was some questions about the administrative costs of these fees. So right, there's arguably it's pretty inexpensive, and we've been doing it for a while to collect the gas tax. It's done relatively upstream, and moving to mileage fee, administrative costs of all the various different options, different rate structures, and if you want to try to segment things between heavy duty and light duty vehicles, would certainly cost more. And we have not looked into those costs, and that's sort of an open question. There's been some ballpark estimates in some studies we're aware of in Vermont, but that was something that would need to be considered. And that's either a cost that has to be passed along or something, a hit on the actual revenue that would be collected.
And I also want to highlight that, the administrative costs partly are complicated because they're going to heavily depend on how you're collecting the mileage, how states currently are set up, whether or not you already collect odometer readings like Vermont does, or if that would be a completely new program that you're setting up. So that's something that, yeah, that we haven't explored, but should definitely be explored in the future.
Let's see, there's another question about, right, we provided some educational experiences, and then does that bias the response? And so that's kind of it's a great question. And of course, part of this was intentional we wanted to provide information that might change the way people answer this question. The idea, of course, or the theory here was that, well, without knowing anything about what the gas tax is used for, what alternatives are, that there's different ways to collect information, various pros and cons of these policies, the answer giving is relatively uninformed and therefore not necessarily accurate either. So we tried to provide factual information. We have the videos. You can take a look. I think they're pretty nicely done. We made them in-house. But you'll see we tried to provide sort of historical information, factual information rather than advocacy. But that's, if someone else had made the videos besides Claire, if the videos were slightly different, information certainly it would have some different effect, and we didn't measure that. But relatively, trying to fill some common knowledge gaps that we're aware of, seem to have changed support, generally increasing it. So it seems there's misinformation and just a lack of really understanding about some of the nuances, and addressing that changed how people felt. So that was kind of the focus of our study, but totally open question whether doing it in a different way would have different results. See, there's questions around, or one we get a lot is, what about, well, big vehicles cause more of the damage, and the gas tax acts like a carbon tax or pollution tax, and so what are the impacts there? And again, it's not something we specifically looked at. However, it's something we hear a lot about, which is why we asked how people would support fees that were based on higher mileage fee for higher emitting vehicles, or like lower rates for EVs. And we saw there is support for making it more of an emission fee, and not so much for giving EVs more of a free ride. That said, in a transition from the gas tax to a mileage fee, it's not as if the gas tax has to be completely phased out. Some portion of it could remain as a carbon tax or pollution fee, and a mileage fee could just be put on top of that. We have a funding gap anyways, so you could reduce the gas tax but keep some portion as that for the purpose of disincentivizing use of fossil fuel. So that's a possibility there. And like we said, there's the possibility to have different rate structures for different classes of vehicles to address the road damage type of thing, or concerns there. And then how to collect. So there is an issue of billing. You pay the gas tax incrementally over the year. Your odometer reading type thing might lead to a big bill at the end of the year if it was collected like in tax season, although it's not a huge fee, but it's a few $100s per vehicle. That could be an unexpected large cost at the end of the year. So there's ways that it could potentially be billed incrementally over the year. Of course, that comes at the cost of higher administrative costs. So those are all, those are not things based on, but need to be looked at.
Yeah, I'll chime in there too. Some of the benefits of using a plug-in device is their ability to be linked to some sort of online billing platform, where users of a mileage fee system could potentially pay kind of like you do with your utilities, just like when you want to, either a monthly bill, an annual bill, what have you. So that's a potential, but again, it has to be weighed against the higher administrative costs of having or distributing those types of devices. I know what some places have considered is they've allowed people to choose the type of mileage collection option that they would like. And so people who would like to be able to use a monthly payment scheme could then opt into using a plug-in device because it's one of the benefits of using that. Similarly with the out-of-state driver concern that I've seen some comments about, we didn't directly address anything about out-of-state drivers, but one of the potential benefits of these GPS-enabled plug-in devices is that you wouldn't necessarily be charged for miles that you're traveling out of state for your state mileage fee. So it could have some sort of boundary on the mileage collection, where the miles you travel out of state either wouldn't be counted or would be distributed to that state in some way. But again, that's a genuine concern that hasn't been fully addressed. I believe that there's some places across the US that are forming coalitions or interstate mileage fee programs to try and address this, but they're all just kind of in the research and pilot phase right now. I don't think that there's been a successful out-of-state or interstate implementation yet.
And just quick follow-up on that too, there's respondents did get a chance to learn about the issue of the in-state versus out-of-state collection when going over the different technologies in the educational video. So that we didn't ask any follow-up about it, but that could have been something that influenced the way they voted. There's a question about how we measured or considered. We mentioned that the VMT fees were less regressive than fuel taxes, and you can read more about it in the paper. But we didn't use Gini coefficients. It's a relatively simple analysis of just looking at income brackets and looking at, so for the same household, how their cost would change, their annual cost would change, and that households in lower income areas would see a smaller increase than households in higher income areas. So that's how we looked at that. And of course, so it's the same households and everything. So nothing else about their cost burdens or tax burdens has changed. There's
another comment too about just the accuracy of odometer readings. And that was also part of the education we shared with respondents in the video, that odometer readings are high potential for inaccuracy. And so having a more accurate mileage collection would be an option with some of these more plug-in devices. But that is a genuine concern for states looking to implement mileage fees using odometer readings. And it's something that they'd have to take into account with the administrative costs of potentially auditing mileages with high penalties or something like that.
And that's going to vary a lot from state to state. So in Vermont, we have a compulsory state inspection, like a lot of states in the Northeast. A technician writes down the odometer reading. In Maine, for example, the odometer reading self-reported when you register your car. So there need to be some sort of audit process. And of course, some states don't have any of these inspections. And so it'd be something totally new. There was a question about...
We have 1 minute left, so we'll have to make this the last one.
Yeah, commercial vehicle fees and weight and stuff. We did not, when looking at revenue neutral fees and stuff, consider any of the other fees that apply to heavy duty vehicles like weight and distance taxes. Similarly, we didn't account registration fees for light duty vehicles. So we just looked at the gas tax and a revenue neutral mileage fee just for the gas tax, not all the other fees and taxes.
But using the data that we have available, we could apply other rate structures and see what would be the equity impacts on households. We just we didn't do that for this project.
All right, great. Thank you so much to Claire and Greg for sharing your work today. And just a reminder for folks, please fill out the evaluation survey. Let us know how you like today's webinar and if you have any ideas for future topics you'd like to hear about. And thank you for taking the time to join us today.